At Thanksgiving, my grandma said, "Glad you're enjoying the college fund we set up." I blinked. What fund? My mom choked on her drink, and my dad went pale. Then my little cousin whispered, "Wait, you didn't know?" And everything fell apart from there. I, 19M, always thought my parents were just careful with money. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. My dad worked as a regional manager at a logistics company, and my mom handled billing at a local medical practice. They made decent money, but our life reflected none of it. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house that my parents bought 20 years ago, drove cars that were at least a decade old, and vacations were road trips to state parks, not beaches or theme parks like my cousins enjoyed. I'd accepted this as normal. My parents preached financial responsibility constantly. When I graduated high school last year, I'd applied to several universities, but ended up at the local community college because that's what we could afford. My parents had sat me down and explained that while they wanted to help, they simply didn't have the money for a 4-year university. I need to work part-time, take out loans, and transfer after getting my associate degree. It stung watching my friends leave for college while I stayed behind, but I understood. Money was tight. That's what I believed until Thanksgiving dinner last month. My dad's side of the family gathered at my uncle's house, as we did every year. My uncle had done well for himself in real estate, and his home showed it. My aunt had set up an enormous spread, and the house buzzed with conversation and laughter. I was helping myself to seconds when my grandmother approached me, her face warm with that particular grandmotherly pride. She squeezed my shoulder and told me how proud she was that I was doing well in school. Then she said it, casual as commenting on the weather. She was glad I was enjoying the college fund she and my grandfather had set up for me when I was born. I stood there, fork halfway to my mouth, and asked her what fund she was talking about. The chatter around us seemed to dim. My grandmother's smile faltered. She looked confused and repeated that she meant the college fund, the one she and my grandfather had established when I was a baby. It should have been more than enough to cover a 4-year degree at any state school, plus living expenses. I felt the room tilt slightly. I told her I didn't know anything about any fund. My grandmother's face went through several expressions before settling on concern. She looked past me, and I turned to see my mother frozen mid-sip, her wine glass trembling in her hand. My father had gone completely pale, his face slack with what I could only describe as trapped panic. My little cousin, my uncle's daughter who was 13 and had been sitting nearby, whispered loud enough for several people to hear. She asked if I really didn't know about the money. The word money seemed to echo. My uncle stood up from the table. My aunt had stopped serving. Everyone was looking at my parents now. My grandmother walked toward my mother and asked what was going on. She asked where the money had gone. My mother set down her glass with a shaking hand. She tried to say something about investments and bad timing, but my grandmother cut her off. The fund had been set up as a trust with my grandfather as the trustee initially, and after he passed, my father had taken over the responsibility. The money was supposed to be untouchable except for educational expenses. My father finally found his voice and suggested we discuss this later, at home, privately. But my uncle wasn't having it. He asked directly how much money we were talking about. My grandmother's voice was steady but cold. She said that over 19 years, with their initial investment and continued contributions, plus compound interest, the fund should have contained approximately $230,000. I actually laughed. It was a nervous, disbelieving sound. That couldn't be real. But my grandmother's face told me it was very real. My aunt asked the obvious question. She wanted to know where the money was. My mother started crying. Not delicate tears, but deep, gasping sobs. My father tried to put his arm around her, but she shrugged him off. Between sobs, she said they'd meant to pay it back. The room went silent except for her crying. My uncle's voice was hard when he demanded to know what they'd spent it on. He wanted to know what could possibly justify stealing from their own son's future. My father's face had gone from pale to red. He said they hadn't stolen anything. They'd borrowed against it, planning to replace it before I needed it. But then things had gotten complicated. I found my voice and asked what things. My father couldn't meet my eyes. He talked about investments that had seemed solid, about opportunities that couldn't be passed up, about bad luck and bad timing. My uncle wasn't buying it. He asked for specifics. That's when my aunt, who'd been quiet until then, spoke up. She asked about the boat. The boat. My parents had bought a 32-foot cabin cruiser 3 years ago. They kept it at a marina 2 hours away and took weekend trips during the summer. I'd been on it a handful of times. They'd told me they'd gotten a great deal, paid cash, and that it was their one indulgence after years of hard work. My father tried to defend the purchase, saying it was about family memories and they'd planned to sell it before I started university. My uncle asked what else. The rest came out in pieces. The kitchen renovation 2 years ago that I'd thought was modest, but apparently cost $40,000. The timeshare in Florida they'd bought and never told me about. My mother's car that wasn't actually a decade old but 3 years old, purchased new. The work trips my father took quarterly that were actually golf vacations with his friends. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. My grandmother had to sit down. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I asked if there was anything left. My father admitted there was about $12,000 remaining. He insisted they'd been working on a plan to replenish it. He had a work bonus coming, and they were going to sell the boat and maybe take out a loan. My uncle's laugh was bitter. He said $12,000 wouldn't cover a single year at a state school. I felt strangely calm, like I was watching this happen to someone else. I asked why they'd lied to me. Why they'd let me believe we couldn't afford college when they'd spent my education on boats and golf trips. My mother tried to reach for me, but I stepped back. She said they'd never meant for it to go this far. They'd always planned to replace the money. They'd thought they had more time. My grandmother's voice cut through. She asked how they could do this to their own child. She and my grandfather had scripted and saved, had foregone their own comforts to ensure I'd have opportunities. And my parents had treated it like their personal slush fund. My father got defensive. He said it was easy for her to judge, but she didn't understand the pressure they'd been under. Everyone around them was living well, taking vacations, having nice things. They'd worked hard too. They deserved something for themselves. My uncle pointed out that what they deserved was what they earned, not money meant for their son's future. The argument escalated. Voices rose. My aunt tried to calm everyone down, but it was useless. Accusations flew. My father's brother pointed out other times my parents had been irresponsible with money. My mother's sister, who'd been silent, quietly mentioned she'd loaned my parents $5,000 2 years ago that they'd never repaid. I walked outside. I couldn't breathe in that room anymore. My cousin found me sitting on the porch steps 20 minutes later. She sat beside me and apologized for saying anything. She'd assumed I knew. She'd heard her parents talking about my college fund before and had thought it was common knowledge. I told her it wasn't her fault. Eventually, I would have found out. Better now than after wasting more time at community college. She asked what I was going to do. I didn't have an answer. When my parents finally emerged, my father tried to approach me, but I held up my hand. I told them I needed time and that I'd find my own way home. My uncle immediately offered to drive me, and I accepted. The drive back was quiet. My uncle told me that if I needed anything, I should call him. He said what my parents did was inexcusable and that he'd help however he could. Update 1. The week after Thanksgiving was surreal. I stayed at my friend's place for 3 days before finally going home. I needed space to process everything, and I couldn't face my parents yet. When I finally returned, they were waiting in the living room like a staged intervention. My mother had clearly been crying for days. My father looked exhausted and defeated. They wanted to talk. I agreed, but only because I needed answers. My father laid out the full financial picture. The boat was worth maybe $25,000 now, less than half what they'd paid because boats depreciate fast, and they'd barely maintained it. The timeshare was essentially worthless, locked into contracts they couldn't break without penalties. The kitchen renovation had added some value to the house, but not nearly what they'd spent. The golf trips, the upgraded furniture, the new appliances, all of it was just gone. He showed me statements and spreadsheets, trying to make me understand how it had happened gradually. A few thousand here for something they convinced themselves was necessary. A few thousand there for an opportunity they couldn't miss. It had snowballed, and they kept telling themselves they'd make it right. My mother apologized repeatedly. She said they'd gotten caught up in trying to maintain appearances and not wanting to feel left behind when everyone around them seemed to be thriving. She said they'd convinced themselves that I'd be fine, that loans were normal, that lots of kids worked their way through college. I asked why they hadn't just been honest. Why they'd let me believe we were struggling when they were spending my money on luxuries. My father had no good answer. He said they were ashamed and that admitting what they'd done would have made it real. As long as they kept quiet, they could pretend they'd fix it before it mattered. I told them they'd stolen from me. I'd spent the last year and a half at community college, working 25 hours a week at a grocery store, exhausting myself to afford classes and books, while they'd been taking weekend trips on a boat bought with my college fund. My mother broke down again. My father asked what I wanted from them. I told them I wanted my money back, but we both knew that wasn't happening. I asked about legal options, and my father admitted that because the trust had him as trustee with broad discretionary powers, and because they were my parents, it would be difficult to prove criminal intent. They'd technically broken a moral obligation more than a legal one. My uncle had already connected me with a lawyer he knew. The lawyer confirmed my father's assessment. We could potentially sue for breach of fiduciary duty, but it would be expensive, time-consuming, and the outcome was uncertain. The best we could hope for was a judgment requiring repayment, but collecting would be another battle. The boat was already listed for sale. My parents were cutting every expense they could. My father was looking into taking a second job. They were exploring options to refinance the house to pull out equity, though with their credit situation and current debt, it wasn't looking promising. But none of that would happen fast enough to help me now. My grandmother called me every few days. She was devastated and felt guilty that she hadn't checked on the funds sooner. She offered to help with my education, but she and my grandfather had lived modestly in retirement. She had some savings, but not enough to replace what was gone. My uncle offered to co-sign loans and help with expenses where he could. My aunt set up a small fund that family members could contribute to. It was something, but it wasn't $230,000. I'd spent the weeks researching options. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I looked into work-study programs. I contacted the universities I'd originally wanted to attend to see if I could still apply for the spring semester with financial aid. Living at home became unbearable. Every time I saw my parents, I felt a mix of anger and disgust. My mother tried to talk to me constantly, seeking forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. My father oscillated between defensive anger and pathetic apologies. I moved into my uncle's basement apartment just after Christmas. He charged me minimal rent and helped me establish independence from my parents. Update 2. By February, I'd pieced together a path forward. I'd been accepted to a state university for the fall semester with a partial academic scholarship based on my community college grades. I'd taken out the maximum federal loans, and my uncle had co-signed a private loan for the gap. I'd be working full-time over the summer and part-time during the school year. It wasn't what it should have been. Instead of focusing on my studies, I'd be constantly stressed about money. Instead of graduating debt-free like my grandparents had intended, I'd be $50,000 in debt minimum by the time I finished, probably more. But I was moving forward. My parents' boat sold in March for $22,000. They immediately transferred the money to an account in my name, which I put toward reducing my loan burden. It helped, but it felt like a drop in an ocean of betrayal. My father took a night job delivering packages. My mother picked up weekend shifts. They were trying, I suppose. They sent me long emails detailing their budget cuts and sacrifice, as if their temporary discomfort somehow balanced out stealing my future. My grandmother established a small monthly transfer to help with expenses. My uncle and aunt did the same. Between their help, my loans, and working myself to exhaustion, I could make it work. What I couldn't make work was forgiving my parents. My mother tried to visit me at my uncle's place in April. I refused to see her. She left a letter that I eventually read. It was pages of apologies and explanations about how they'd gotten lost, how they'd made terrible choices, how they never stopped loving me. I felt nothing reading it. Or maybe I felt too much, so much anger and hurt that it all compressed into numbness. My father showed up at my work one day. He waited until my shift ended and asked if we could talk. I told him there was nothing to say. He'd made his choices, and now we all had to live with them. He said he'd spend the rest of his life making it up to me. I told him he couldn't. There was no making up for what he'd done. He'd taken something that wasn't his and destroyed my trust completely. I told him I'd accepted that I'd have to build my future myself, without help from the people who should have protected it. He left crying. I started therapy in May. My therapist helped me process the betrayal and complicated grief. Because that's what it was, grief. I'd lost something I'd never known I had, and I'd lost the parents I'd thought I knew. The people who'd raised me to value honesty and responsibility had turned out to be liars and thieves. My grandmother's health deteriorated over the summer. The stress and guilt had taken a toll. She was hospitalized briefly in June, and I visited her every day. She apologized constantly, saying she should have monitored the fund, should have checked in, should have known. I told her it wasn't her fault. She'd done something generous and trusting. My parents had exploited that trust. She made me promise I'd finish college no matter what. She said my grandfather would have been heartbroken to know what happened, but proud that I was pushing forward anyway. I promised. I started at the university in August. The transition was harder than it should have been because I was carrying so much weight, financial and emotional. But I was there. Despite everything, I was there. I haven't spoken to my parents since that conversation with my father in April. They've tried reaching out through relatives, through messages, through letters. I haven't responded. My uncle thinks I should eventually have some contact, if only for closure. My therapist says I'll know when and if I'm ready. Right now, I'm not ready. Maybe I never will be. What my parents did wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal at the deepest level. They looked at resources meant for my future and decided their comfort mattered more. They lied to my face while I worked myself exhausted believing we had no choice. I think about alternate timelines sometimes. The one where they'd been honest. Where they'd said they'd made mistakes and worked together with me to fix it. Where they'd sold the boat years ago and cut their spending and prioritized what they should have. But that's not what happened. Instead, they stole, lied, and got caught. And now I'm building a future on debt and anger while they perform regret. I don't know if I'll ever forgive them. I don't know if they deserve forgiveness. What I do know is that I'll never let anyone have that kind of power over my future again. I'll never trust easily. I'll never assume people, even family, will do right by me. My parents taught me that lesson. It cost them a relationship with their son. It cost me everything I thought I knew about my family. I'm 20 now. I'm a junior by credits thanks to my community college work. I'll graduate next year if everything goes according to plan. I'll have debt, but I'll have a degree. And I'll have done it despite my parents, not because of them. That's going to have to be enough.